Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Geographical.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in the Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian
History Soundbites, and this episode is going to be about the Haskala movement, the Jewish enlightenment in Russia, Czarist Russia in the 19th century. Excuse me. Right before that, a quick correction from last episode. It was about the Karaites in Russia, the Russian Empire, and at the end of the episode I mentioned about just as a postscript about the Holocaust, and I mistakenly made it sound as if just because there was someone that I interviewed who was saved by a Karaite, so I mistakenly made it sound like all Karaites were really good and helped rabbinic Jews or regular Jews be saved in the Holocaust. And unfortunately, it was not the case. I should have been more clear. There are actually many that had the opportunity to save Jews and chose not to because of the age-old animosity between Karaite Jews and rabbinic Jews. And that's a tragic story and does not cast them in great light. And one of my most favorite and knowledgeable listeners was kind enough to point it out. So I just wanted to correct that for the record. But now moving on to another group in Czarist Russia in the 19th century, Haskala in Russia. And there's a big, huge misconception, which I very often talk about. I've discussed this topic in the past several times. It's one of my favorite topics about what is Haskala and also the difference between Haskala and secularization, both in general, in other words, in other parts of Europe as well, and in Russia. This particular episode is going to specifically discuss in Russia in the 19th century, but I really, in general, want to turn the entire topic on its head. It's really an episode on its own merit or a series for another time because it's its own topic about what is the Haskala and what is the difference between Haskala and secularization, and are the two even related? Did Haskala lead to secularization? Was Haskala secularization itself? Absolutely not. And we're going to talk about that today, and specifically in the context of Russia during the 19th century. In order to understand it properly, we need to take a step back and define some terms, some historical events and personalities, the chronological sequence of what took place, and most of all, the perceived and actual impact of the Haskala movement. Because, it's very often seen as a movement of secularization, which it was not. And secularization of the Jewish people took place because of primarily external factors. We give the Haskala much more credit than it deserves. External factors meaning changes in the world. It was the modern era, changes in political systems, emancipation, the changes in migration patterns, urbanization, economic changes, the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the railroad, and other things like that. So it was much less to do with a couple of maskilim who promoted certain changes, who themselves were religiously observant. Almost all the maskilim that I'm aware of, at least until we get to the radical Haskala of the 1870s, which is much... we're going to get to that, hopefully, in this series. By the way, this topic is really big, so we might have to split it into 2 episodes. So you'll have to be patient for part 2 if we don't get everything in part 1. But the biggest question here, which we're going to have some surprising answers, is Haskala and secularization, and what exactly was the Haskala, and what did it do to the Jewish people in the course of the Russian Empire of the 19th century, and of course down to this very day. There's some really, really good material. There's a ton. There's absolute enormous amount has been written on this. I used primarily Professor Mati Zalkin, his books and his essays, but there's loads of other sources as well. So much has been written on the topic. The Haskala wanted to make fundamental changes to the cultural, social, and economic and political systems of the Jewish community in Russia. And they want to make religious changes also. They want to make changes in halacha. Initially, for sure not. They themselves were primarily religiously observant, Shomer Shabbos, as we would say, or Shomer Torah Mitzvahs, in the traditional sense. They wanted to make cultural, social, economic, and political changes of the Jewish community in Russia. Eventually, there was an element of the radical Haskala in the 1870s, which lasted for a short time, which did promote halachic changes. Were they successful or not? Not really. Hard to say. Secularization ran parallel to the Haskala and was happening anyway, regardless of whether the Haskala existed or not. And the secularization of the Jewish people in Russia was a deterministic trend that had pretty much nothing to do with the Haskala, and happened because it was the Jewish people in the modern era. And the Jewish people in the modern era, as the Christians in the modern era, as pretty much every other people in the modern era, especially in Europe, they went through a process of secularization. But the Haskala, they wanted to have all these, like I said, cultural, social, economic, and political changes in the Jewish community, and they faced a conservative society, conservative establishment, leadership and establishment, community, who was against any change and desired to preserve traditional Jewish life as it was. The Russian Jewish Haskala developed and was influenced by 3 factors. Number 1, the Jewish Haskala in Central Europe. The Jewish Haskala in Central Europe predated the Russian Jewish Haskala, so Central Europe as in Germany, Holland, Amsterdam, Italy, Prague, all those areas, Vienna, Central Europe, Western Europe even. Number 2, the Enlightenment, the non-Jewish Enlightenment within the Russian Empire. The Imperial Russia had a elite, movement of Enlightenment, writers and intellectuals, like it was in the rest of Europe at the time. United States at the time, right? This is the time of the American Revolution, French Revolution. It's the age of Enlightenment. So the Jewish Enlightenment, the Jewish Haskala, was influenced by the non-Jewish Enlightenment as well. That was the second factor. And the third was a general exposure to literature. The printing press made literature more available, and obviously the printing press was invented a few centuries earlier, but until literature became more accessible, and advancements in technology and printing and distribution and travel, so that made content and exposure much more available. So in general, literature became more available, and this had an impact on the development of the Russian Haskala as well. Now, I want to emphasize the first point, the Jewish Haskala of Central Europe and how it reaches the Russian Haskala of Eastern Europe. There's migration patterns. Galician merchants, Galician Haskala, which is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there's Galician merchants who had been influenced by the Galician Haskala, which is not in Russia. But some of them settle in Odessa, which is in Russia. And then you have in the north the Russian cities, Russian border areas in the north are influenced by the German, at that time, German cities of Königsberg and Memel, which were centers of the German Haskala, had large Haskala populations, so that had an impact across the border in the Baltic states, the Kurland area of the Russian Empire. And there were also fellows from German or Central European Haskala who were sometimes hired by the Tsarist government to modernize the Jews of the Russian Empire or to modernize the Jewish educational system in the Russian Empire. The most famous or infamous of these characters was Dr. Max Lilienthal, who I spoke about in the Volozhin series several years ago, who was brought in by Tsar Nicholas I and his famous education minister Sergei Uvarov, who we'll speak about, to reform the educational system of Russian Jewry. So he was a German maskil who was later in the United States as a reform rabbi. But there were others as well. There were also Jewish doctors in Russia who had studied in Central European universities in Germany and Italy primarily, or Jewish university students who returned to Russia following their studies because it was very hard to get into Russian universities. So Jewish students in Russia very often went to German universities and then came back to Russia to serve as doctors or whatever, lawyers, in the early 1800s. And they brought with them the ideas and ideals of the Jewish German Haskala. There was also another trend, which was wealthy Russian Jewish merchants and businessmen who maintained extensive connections with their counterparts, in other words, wealthy Jewish merchants and businessmen in Western and Central Europe, and they also brought back ideas of there's the outsized role played by the Tsarist government itself, especially in the mid-19th century. The education minister Sergei Uvarov and others in the Tsarist government of Nicholas I and Alexander II in promoting modernization and enlightenment ideals within the Pale. This was very often referred to as the Haskala Mitam. It's the Haskala, but it's not the Jewish Haskala. It's the Haskala being kind of forced upon or legislated upon the Russian Jewish community by the Tsarist government. And this legislation affects traditional Jewish communal life. The annulment of the Kahal in 1844 was a legislation by the Tsarist government which destroyed the Kahal system. There's many, many other such examples trying to reform education. We'll get to it. In general, the absolutist rule of the Tsarist government and how they wanted a centralized government without Jewish autonomy, the economic changes promulgated by the Tsarist government, the technological advancements, especially in the second half of the 19th century, the laying down the railroads in the Tsarist Empire, the Industrial Revolution in the Tsarist Empire towards the end of the century, factories and internal migration, which leads to urbanization. Urbanization is a breakdown of Jewish traditional life, and immigration out of Russia. All of these and more had a much larger impact on modernizing and transforming Jewish life and secularizing Jewish life than a few Nebuch Maskilim who wrote pamphlets and books that very few people read. So the Tsarist government itself, which is, like I said, the Haskala Mitam during the reign of Tsar Nicholas I, or the great reforms of Tsar Alexander II, had a huge and decisive impact on Russian Jewish society, and much more than the Russian Jewish Haskala movement. There were early leaders who promoted Haskala in Russia. This is the in-between generation. In the late 18th century, there's Jewish, again, these are all from religious Jews who promoted learning outside knowledge, general subjects, languages, Russian, German, and being more open to the surrounding society. Some of these people in the late 18th century were even associated with the circle of the Vilna Gaon or his associates. And there has been much controversy over the last few years if these fellas deserve to be referred to as maskilim or proto-maskilim, if we consider this to be prior to there being a so-called Haskala movement, or do we consider them mainstream religious Jews who had some interesting views? That's all. So my view is, being how I define Haskala and Maskilim. I don't define Haskala and Maskilim as secularization, because these people did not promote secularization, neither were they themselves secular. So these individuals' credentials make them bona fide Maskilim, or at least proto-Maskilim, this despite the fact that there has been much revisionist history in recent years attempting to refute this claim and reclaiming them as legitimate traditional rabbis. So I hope this isn't considered controversial or offensive to anyone, and I hope I don't receive too much flack for this. But people like Rav Baruch Schick of Shklov, or Menashe of Ilya, or Yisrael of Zamush, and most of all, Mendel Laffin, who definitely promoted Haskala ideals, all these people are proto-Maskilim or even authentic Maskilim, depending on how you define the difference between proto-Maskilim or authentic Maskilim, part of the Haskala movement, because they promoted Haskala ideals. Again, if you separate Haskala from secularization, you say Haskala was promoting exposure to the outside world, learning general subjects, knowing the language of the country, integrating more into society. Then, if that's the Haskala, that's the ideals of the Haskala, that's the Haskala movement, and not anything to do with secularization, then these people definitely fit into that model. Then, of course, as things develop in the early 1800s, we have the early and the prominent early Maskilim, actual Maskilim of Russia. One of the most famous ones who had an outsized impact on the Russian Haskala for the balance of the 19th century was a fellow by the name of Yitzchak Ber Levinson, better known as Ribal. He was the author of many Haskala tracts and became, like the writings and books and pamphlets which defined the Haskala movement for the ensuing decades, the most famous of which was Teuda B'Yisrael. And by the early decades of the 19th century, the Haskala was spreading rapidly throughout the Pale of Settlement and Congress Poland through printed works and attempts at educational reform. Now, I said it was spreading rapidly. Does that mean it was a mass movement? No. To the best of our knowledge, it was never a mass movement. Was it an organized or centralized movement? No. Most definitely not. How many adherents did it have? Very hard to know, because it was not a organized or centralized movement. It didn't have an organized, centralized leadership either. And we still can't even agree on what constitutes a maskil. So there's lots of points to ponder once we understand that the link between the Haskala and secularization is tenuous at best and non-existent at worst. So different types of... There were actually, we just throw out the term Haskala in Russia, but there are very different types of Russian Haskala in different geographical locations across the Russian Empire. There was Haskala in Odessa. In Congress Poland was different. Congress Poland, like I said in many episodes before, is sometimes considered part of the Pale of Settlement, and sometimes it's considered its own autonomous entity, depending on which context. Especially in Congress Poland, where the Haskala was active, was Warsaw itself. Then there's New Russia, southern Russia, which was the area of Kherson and southern Ukraine of today. Then there's central Ukraine, Volyn and Podolia, those areas, which are relatively near Galicia. And then there's northern Russia, which borders northwestern Russian Empire, which bordered on Germany, which had an influenced by German enlightenment, German Haskala, and German secularization. That was the areas of Kurland, the Baltic states, and then there was the Haskala of Vilna, of Lithuania, the surrounding areas of Vilna. Now, what were the primary differences between all these different geographical areas and the Haskala in each area, and what drove these differences? Why was Vilna specifically, and Lithuania more generally, how did it become such a Haskala center despite it being such an ancient, prestigious, and traditional community, which is very different than Odessa or Warsaw, which was not, when neither of those were ancient or traditional communities. So places like Odessa and Warsaw, which did not have an old tradition, so when Jews started to settle there, so the Haskala spread there quite rapidly, and secularization at the same time also spread there quite rapidly, because these were new communities without ancient traditions. So it made sense. What about a place like Vilna, which was Yerushalayim Delita, which was the ancient center of Torah life, of the Vilna Gaon, of many others? So Vilna, and in general, and Lithuania more generally, so it had this rationalist, analytical, intellectual tradition, as opposed to many other parts of the Russian Empire, especially further south in Congress Poland and Ukraine, which had a Hasidic mystical tradition. By the same token, the rationalism and moderate environment of Lithuanian Jewry and the Lithuanian rabbinate also slowed the spread of the Hasidic movement to that same region in the 18th century, and it also prevented conservative orthodoxy or extreme orthodoxy, whatever you want to call it, radical orthodoxy, ultra-orthodoxy, like in Hungary. This rationalism and moderate environment in Lithuania prevented that type of orthodoxy from striking roots in Lithuania as well. So in Hungary, you had this more conservative orthodoxy of the Chassam Sofer. In Congress Poland and in Ukraine, you had the Hasidic tradition. In Lithuania, you had neither. So what you had is this moderate traditionalism, primarily non-Hasidic, with a rationalist bent. That was a very ripe environment for the Haskala to flourish. Hasidism and a very conservative Hungarian style, Chassam Sofer style orthodoxy were very anti-modernist movements, and they were very anti-Haskala, or reform in the case of Hungary, neolog. So that's all on the traditionalist side of things that enabled the Haskala to flourish in Lithuania. On the Haskala side of things, there was significant differences between the Vilna Lithuanian Haskala and other areas in where the Haskala operated in Russia, such as Odessa or other places. In the Lithuanian Haskala, the Haskala was more nuanced, more moderate, very non-confrontational. The Haskala in Lithuania sought unity, and they sought what can be shared with the traditional establishment. They did not seek out conflict or differences. In general, the Vilna Haskala was more traditional, more intellectual, more respectful, more slower and a gradual process, not a very radical version, which was common in other areas of modernization in Haskala. And therefore, on both sides, you had this, this enabled the Haskala to flourish in a place like Vilna. Which leads us to the next point, because what was the response of tradition to the Haskala movement developing and growing in Russia? So in general, there's a general trend, and then there's three specific responses. So first, in general, I want to go over what the responses of tradition were. The Haskala and Maskilim were never welcomed by the established religious community. They were always opposed. It was never that. There was never a place that we know of in Russia or anywhere else for that matter that the Haskala, these new things, Orthodoxy is a conservative society. Traditional Jewish communities are a conservative society. Changes and new things and modernization are never welcomed. So they were never welcomed. But the responses ranged from suspicion to hostility. Suspicion is one type of response. Hostility is the other. And there's all types of responses in between suspicion and hostility. At an ideological level, the values promulgated by the Haskala stood in contradiction to the timeless values of the traditional community, even when the Haskala was not promoting secularization, even when the Maskilim themselves were religious. But at the ideological level, these values were still in contradiction to the values of the traditional community. This is usually the only element of suspicion or disagreement mentioned when discussing what divided the two positions. What is generally overlooked is the social, political, and economic aspects of the opposition. For instance, the education reform that was promoted by the Haskala was not just a religious issue. It wasn't that it contradicted the religious values. It was also a financial one. The huge cheder yeshiva educational system employed huge numbers of individuals whose livelihood would be at stake if the educational reforms desired by the government and promoted by the Haskala would be implemented, as it would require all sorts of licensing and regulation and modernizing of the school system. The same thing with the rabbinate. The rabbinate reform, which was promoted by the Haskala and the government, and the opening of the infamous rabbinical schools in Zhytomyr and Vilna by the Tsarist government in the 1840s, it was not just a religious issue, but a social/economic issue as well, regarding the control of the supply of rabbis, which would generate competition in the field, and also the political power that was wielded with the rabbinical position. The leadership positions maskilim gained within the community, in the Jewish communities, as a result of government connections and intervention, or of government employment of maskilim as rav mitams or similar positions of power, threatened to upend the traditional power structure of the kahal and facilitated the creation of an alternative leadership within the Jewish community for the first time in history. There was not just the kahal establishment leadership or the rabbinical leadership. There was now another type of leadership that had close connections to the Tsarist government, in addition or even instead of the traditional form of leadership. Having said that, this is a general overview. There were three primary responses from the traditionalists to the inroads of the Haskala in various parts of the Russian Empire over the course of the 19th century. The first response was in the major cities, the major urban environments, especially where there was no centuries-old traditional religious establishments, such as in Odessa, Warsaw, Riga, and several other cities, or even outside the Pale of Settlement, Moscow, St. Petersburg. The Haskala in these areas advanced very quickly, usually with the support of the local financial elite, local businessmen and merchants, Jewish local businessmen and merchants, and the Haskala advanced with rather little or sometimes even no opposition because the religious establishment was either non-existent or it was very weak, it was very small, because these were new places, Odessa, Warsaw, Riga, or they were either new or there was no. It was very urban, also big cities. So the religious establishment was often a defensive minority relatively early on. It's worth bearing in mind that in these major cities, there was early secularization as well, in addition to the Haskala. In other words, before the Haskala and independent of the Haskala, running parallel to the Haskala movement, there was also secularization that was taking place, especially among the financial elite in these cities. And that played a role there as well. It was easier for the Haskala to establish itself in places where there was already a secularized element of the Jewish community. In Warsaw, for instance, there was an early movement of assimilationists, which was completely independent of and really totally at odds with the ideals of the Haskala. The Haskala did not promote assimilation. The Haskala promoted a strong Jewish identity, which was modernized, which was different than the established traditional religious identity, but it definitely was not assimilationist. So the assimilationists in Warsaw were at odds with the Haskala, and there was disputes between the two groups. But in Warsaw, there already was assimilationists when the Haskala took hold in Warsaw. That was one response in the major cities. The second response was the moderate Haskala and the moderate response in the Lithuanian areas that I already mentioned. These seems to be almost like a preordained arrangement that the Haskalas themselves in Lithuania and Vilna were not so radical. They were pretty moderate. They were traditionalists. They were religious Jews also. And they were willing to work well with the establishment. And likewise, the religious establishment, from the rabbis down, the Kahal, everyone, while fundamentally disagreeing with many of the platforms of Haskala, no one welcomed them, and they definitely disagreed with them, and they were very opposed to many of the Haskala values in their platforms, but they were willing to work with them and accommodate them and look the other way sometimes, not to go in all-out war. There was no violent opposition. That was the response in places like Vilna and other areas of Lithuania. Those two responses are the less famous ones. The third response is the more famous response. I would call it the classic response, especially in the heavily Hasidic areas of Congress Poland, Ukraine, Volyn, White Russia, Belarus, etc. There's this active, organized, and relentless opposition, animosity, and no compromise with the Haskala movement. This is a story of the Hasidic movement and its development in the 19th century. This is a story of the Haskala, and in this context, it's a story of Russian Jewry in the 19th century. That is the most famous and classic response, and many of the leaders of that opposition were often very famous Hasidic leaders. The Tzemach Tzedek of Chabad, the third Rebbe of Chabad, Rabbi Nachum Mendel Schneerson, was one of the most prominent ones, a very, very strong leader in this regard of fighting against the Haskala in a very strong and open way, and against the inroads that the Haskala were making and the values that they promoted. Several others from Congress Poland, such as Rabbi Yitzchak Kavorka, the Chidushei Rim of Ger, and many, many others. There's definitely lots to say on this, and I know that the listeners are probably expecting this to be the main part of the story, the rabbis who fought for tradition against the Haskala, but I think we'll suffice with that. Now, an important part of this whole story is the relationship that the Maskilim had with the Tsarist government. The Haskala mitam, in other words, the government ordained Haskala during the reign of Tsar Nicholas I and his education minister Sergei Uvarov. What was the role of the Maskilim during that time? And then again during the great reforms of Tsar Alexander II, and what was the role of the Haskala during this time? So it's two different time periods. So from the beginning of the 19th century, the Tsarist government and the emerging Haskala ideology of the Maskilim believed in several common denominators in their vision of the future of Russian Jewish society. In other words, the vision of the Haskala and the vision of the Tsarist government regarding the future of Russian Jewry dovetailed in several important crucial areas. They both endeavored for more integration and less isolation between Jews and general society. They both felt that the most efficient means of achieving that goal was to reform the communal structure of the Kahal, the educational infrastructure, the external expressions of Jewish identity, such as traditional Jewish dress, which is the so-called Gzeras Hamalbushim of the mid-19th century. So there's several areas that the Haskala and the Russian Tsarist government agreed with each other. And this process of cooperation between Maskilim and the government also translated into many Maskilim being employed by the government in various positions, such as censors, teachers, consultants, physicians, while even those not employed by the government, in other words, Maskilim not employed by the government, often employed the use of submitting memorandums to government officials and offices containing their ideas and vision and requests for change in Jewish society in Russia. And it's worth noting that many Maskilim possessed skills which the Russian government valued that most Jews in the Pale of Settlement did not possess. And this facilitated their relationship with governmental bodies as well. What were those skills? Very often Maskilim were proficient in the Russian language, and very often they possessed general education, either a gymnasium or university level education. So it was very natural that the Russian government would turn to them as being representatives of the Jewish community, even if they were not. And here are a couple of points which must be clarified for the sake of historical accuracy. This is obviously not a defense or anything of the sort or of the Haskala movement, obviously no justification. But in the effort to view the Haskala as full collaborators with the Tsarist agenda and all the stigma that entails, we just have to set the record straight on that point. Since the Tsar was generally an enemy of the Jews, which is pretty much the case throughout the history of the Romanovs in the Russian Empire regarding the Jewish community, so anyone who collaborated with the Tsar's government was obviously a evil collaborator, and it's even more perfidious when it's a deliberate action by fellow Jews. So the Haskala cooperating with the Tsarist government, it definitely fits the narrative as the all-encompassing evil, the Haskala Ha'arura, which not only did they want to destroy Jewish life, but they also collaborated with the evil Tsarist government. But while the religious establishment had many justifiable disputes regarding the Haskala's agenda, and many issues which conflicted with the conservative worldview of the religious establishment, one thing that certainly cannot be said about the Haskala was that they were out to destroy the Jewish people. The Haskala was definitely not trying to destroy the Jewish people. They didn't side with the Tsar against the Jews. That's a very inaccurate portrayal of the Haskala movement and the Maskilim themselves. They were generally honestly out there for the betterment of the Jewish people, according to their values, which the traditional establishment obviously disagreed with. And whether one agreed with their platform or not, the Haskala definitely had the best interests of the community at heart, generally. From the Haskala's point of view, the role of their cooperation with the government was a cautious cooperation on issues regarding the future of the Jewish people in Russia, which met their own ideas for the flourishing of the community in the modern era. The Haskala never wholeheartedly endorsed the full gamut of the Tsar's reforms, whether under Nicholas or even under Alexander, who was considered relatively more liberal. The political and economic connections which many Maskilim developed and brought them in close contact with government officials, along with their knowledge of Russian, enabled them to see and obtain an understanding of the government's objectives and the realities. They felt that some of this could be utilized for their own respective Haskala agendas regarding the modernizing of the Jewish people in Russia, but it was a very pragmatic approach of cooperation. They never cooperated, at least officially or institutionally, with the government to the extent that it was detrimental to the physical or security interests of their brethren in Russia. Of course, some did as individuals, but they were generally the exception and not the rule. And of course, there were religious collaborators as well from the traditional establishment, but no one would generalize them either. There were always members of the Jewish community, the establishment, and others, unfortunately, who either because of payment or some other reason, unfortunately collaborated on behalf of the Tsarist government. That was an unfortunate reality. But this was never the mainstream, and they were generally isolated instances of individuals. So the accusation which painted the entire Haskala as traitors to their people was used as a polemical weapon in the endless disputes between the conservative religious establishment and the Haskala, but it does not really stand up to historical scrutiny. A great example of this can be illustrated is regarding the military draft, which is great current event subject too here in Israel, especially under the draconian rule of Tsar Nicholas I and the awful Cantonist decrees, but to a certain extent even under his successor Alexander II. The Maskilim never supported the discriminatory and cruel military draft of the Jews in Russia, even though one would think that the Haskala would promote patriotism and civic participation and integration in the military draft. But the Haskala in Russia recognized the draft in Russia, under Nicholas especially, the Cantonist decrees, for what it was. They recognized it as a dangerous and cruel legislation that was unfair and discriminatory towards the Jewish community as a collective. So they did not support the military draft. So that's a surprising reality. In fact, it was the establishment Kahal, the, quote, legitimate leaders of the traditional Jewish community, who, whether it was by coercion or desperation, a necessity, who did cooperate with the Tsarist military officials by hiring chaper, kidnappers, using public Kahal funds to pay for them to kidnap Jewish recruits during the era of the Cantonists. We've covered that in a previous episode. So cooperation between the establishment, in fact, there was sometimes cooperation between the establishment and the Maskilim on communal issues in the face of Tsarist oppression. Very often, the traditional establishment and the Maskilim worked together. Because the Maskilim had these government connections, they very often, when there was a Gzeira, when there was all kinds of, against the security or things like that of the Jewish people, blood libels and pogroms and things like that, very often the Maskilim and the religious establishment worked very well together, helping the Jewish community in the face of Tsarist oppression. That was actually quite often the case. In fact, the Haskala newspapers were very much like that. Famously, the editor who was a Maskil, Alexander Ziderboim of Hamelitz, the most largely distributed newspaper in Russia, first in Odessa, later St. Petersburg, and it was definitely a Haskala publication, and he was definitely a Maskil, but he saw himself and he saw the role of his newspaper as defending the Jewish people against the Russian anti-Semites, against Tsarist oppression. And he was always out there promoting the well-being and safety and security of the Jewish people. So despite the fact that the Haskala had many values that were opposed to the religious establishment, and despite their endless disputes, but they're not out there to destroy the Jewish people, obviously. So changes the Maskilim adopted for themselves and wished for in the transformation and modernization, but not necessarily secularization, as I keep on mentioning, of Jewish society in Russia. They wanted all kinds of integration changes in the economy and education and stuff like that. But we tend to give the Haskala way more credit than it deserves. At worst, they contributed indirectly and in a very minor and almost insignificant way towards secularization. And it's likely that it had zero impact whatsoever on secularization, because secularization was happening in parallel to the Haskala, not as a result of the Haskala. And it was taking place because of general trends, external issues of general society, especially in Russia. It's even possible, and here I'm really going out on a limb here, it's even possible that it actually slowed secularization and assimilation by providing, and ultimately unsuccessful, of course, but by providing a framework of providing a Jewish identity in the modern era, instituting changes in the Jewish community in the modern era. The secularization was much more related to external factors. So why do we give the Haskala so much more credit than it deserves? Because external factors are faceless. External factors are nuanced, they're complicated, they're generally huge trends of outside society. They're trends that we can't control, such as economy, politics, governments, emancipation. They're sometimes scary, they're sometimes overwhelming and complicated to understand, such as technological change and migration trends. And they're related to these large processes of gradual process of political systems and economic systems and social realities and cultural realities in the larger general non-Jewish society. And add to that point that the fact that no one was able to criticize the Tsar. Haskala Mitam, for instance. Can you publicly criticize Sergei Uvarov, the education minister of the Tsar? Can you criticize Nicholas I or even the great reforms of Alexander II? If you criticize the Tsar publicly, you go to Siberia. So you criticize the Tsar's government. It's like a death sentence. So instead of focusing on external trends and these outside trends and all these other factors and blaming the Tsar, which we can't do, so we find a local enemy. We're able to define a local enemy. We're able to put a face to the local enemy, the Haskala. It's close by. It's within the community. It's safe and easy to blame, to point fingers, and therefore that enters the traditional religious consciousness and collective memory, the ultimate evil, the antithesis, the red line that shouldn't be crossed, the ones we're against, the ones who define what's wrong about the modern era, and therefore this becomes the face of the challenges of the modern era to traditional society. This is the first half of the story of the Russian Jewish Haskala. The second half is already prepared. It's going to come out within the next day or two, because it's already, I wouldn't say it's recorded because I'm recording as we speak, but it's all ready. And the second half, if you like the first half, the second half is even better. So tell your friends and family that waiting for them to join us for the second half of the story of the Russian Jewish Haskala. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.